first programs I wrote were just on a little computer language that I kind of made up, a Wang computer of some sort. It was very early, and I just used those instructions to try to write my own programs to do things like play tic-tac-toe. And so I remember sitting around literally writing programs in this language for which there really wasn't a computer. Always really interested in technology and computers. I mean, obviously growing up watching Star Trek and Lost in Space and sci-fi of all sorts, it was always computers. And I've had a good life at this point, no regrets. I enjoy the problems I have to solve on a day-to-day basis. It's really rewarding to know that people are out there making music and processing audio using my tools. I knew I didn't really want to become an academic. I really sort of wanted to do my own thing, see if I could write software, do consulting, and spin it into some kind of a business.
Hello everyone, this is Ray Williams, and here we are with another IMSTA Meet the Developers. Today we're going to talk to a very good friend of mine who I've known for a very long time, Mr. Bill Gardner from Wave Arts, who's down there in Boston, Massachusetts. How are you doing, Bill?
I'm doing great today. Thanks, Ray.
How is the weather? I have to ask.
Well, we got a couple of feet of snow last weekend and another wet snowstorm coming in this weekend with a hard freeze afterwards. So looking forward to that.
In these north climates, that's what we do. We talk about the weather, right? So tell me about yourself. You are a plugin developer, and you have this company, Wave Arts. And how has that been? Just sort of generally, how's it been having your own software company making plugins?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's been good. It hasn't come without some amount of self-doubt. One always has a little self-doubt in life, I suppose, about the decisions you made. The great thing is that I love doing the work and the problems I have to solve. That's the key thing. So it keeps me interested and constantly sort of challenged and thinking.
Are you born in the Boston area?
Yeah, I was born in Connecticut, actually. My family moved around quite a bit. My dad kept jumping from job to job, so we never really stayed in any area for more than a few years. But I was mostly around the Boston area.
And what kind of work did your dad do?
He was an engineer. Got a degree in mechanical engineering from RPI, later went to Harvard Business, and he had jobs kind of in engineering management. For example, he worked at the Norton Company, which was a company that most people know makes grindstones, because they were in a lot of abrasives. But they had a lot of other businesses. One of the things they made was the Mylar film that went on the outside of the Lunar lander. Just a kind of a weird little trivia item there. That gold foil, you remember, that was on the Lunar lander? That was his little division that made those metallized products. And we used to wrap Christmas presents in that stuff. And I wish I had a roll of it. And it was very good for wrapping presents in. It was very pretty. So he did other things like that. Got into plastics and other products.
Do you remember the watching Neil Armstrong step on the moon?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, it was a very pivotal moment.
Was your dad and everybody around at the same time? Were you there with him?
I imagine so, yeah. We're all huddled around the TV.
And what does it feel like to know that somebody in that home made something that was on that lunar lander?
I guess it's pretty cool. I never really thought of him as having, a really direct impact in the space program. They made lots of metallized sort of fabric products. This product called like the space blanket, which was like a sort of emergency rescue blanket you could have in your car or something. You put it on and the metal reflected. It's just one of those kind of weird coincidences that company was also asked to build this protective foil for the lunar lander, and so it's kind of cool. And I do wish I had saved some of it, because now that all those sort of little trivia, those little items about anything having to do with the space program is like highly sought after now.
And did you guys have musical equipment in the home?
Well, we had a grand piano. My mom played piano when she was a kid growing up, and her parents brought her a beautiful baby grand Steinway. But it was strange. She just stopped playing, but she loved it as a piece of furniture. So it was kind of this beautiful piece of furniture that was in our living room. but we didn't play it. I tried to noodle around on it a little bit. We had a bunch of little piano books and stuff. I would go through and play like Silver Skates, which had a B flat in it. So I got to play the the black key once, and that sounded cool. It was different than the white key. So I do have some memories of that, but it's a pity now. I mean, I wish, thinking back on it, that I had gotten piano lessons and been more exposed to music. I mean, my parents listened to music, but neither one really was a musician. I found out much later, though, that my grandmother, my dad's mom, apparently was a very good piano player, and she used to play all the time at the churches, and she was sort of on demand in her town in New Jersey for piano playing. I had no idea. I found that out much later. So music wasn't really a huge thing in life growing up, other than just, I had two older brothers who were listening to Jimi Hendrix and stuff, and the Beatles. And so I got exposed to their music. My parents were listening to, much more, Al Hirt kind of 40s and 50s big bands kind of music. So I had some exposure.
Now, did you start playing an instrument later on in school?
Yeah, when I got into college, I got interested in playing guitar and just started noodling around on it and I just basically taught myself. And that was great. I mean, I love playing. So I was really into music then, listening to a lot of fusion and jazz and rock and, just really loved being able to pick up a guitar and try to learn some of the songs and play. It was fun.
Did you ever play in a band?
Yeah, I had some pickup bands in college. Later, I think we'll talk about this later, but I ended up working at Kurzweil Music Systems, where basically everybody there was a musician. There were lots of sort of jam sessions. Every time anybody had a party, everybody would end up playing music at the end of the party, because most everybody had a studio in their basement of some sort. And even to this day, I mean, I still have a group of friends. We all play music, and it's jazz and show tunes kind of stuff. And so we get together periodically and rehearse, and play things like block parties, or they have these music festivals around here. I imagine they're fairly common everywhere, but they call them Porch Fest. I think it might have started in Somerville, Mass, but they basically invite all the local bands they pick a day. Everybody, they have sort of some central organization, so you kind of get a listing. People can get a listing of all the bands that are playing and where they're playing and kind of what style. So you get a little map, and they can walk around town on like the Sunday afternoon and go check out all these different local bands. And the idea is you go out and play on your porch. So it's a real fun scene. You go out and you play your set, and people just walking around the street sort of gather in front of your house and listen for a while, and then move on and go see somebody else. So that's the kind of thing I'm doing these days. I'm not a pro.
Right.
Not playing clubs or anything.
Did you ever write music?
No, I've never composed. I think about it. I think I'm working up to it.
So it's clear to say that music became an integral part of your life when you really got into college, because you're still playing it.
Oh yeah, it works on so many dimensions. I mean, there's a sort of intrigue about music. Like, what is it? Why do we like it? It's some kind of like an emotional communication medium, kind of like language, but different. And just the theory of music, it's kind of mathematical, and there's a lot to it. Kind of figuring out why tunes sound good, the interplay between harmony and melody. There's a lot of theory there, and so it's kind of appealing at an intellectual level. But then it's just really fun to play, and it's a really social thing to get together with friends and play music. Is a kind of a wonderful thing to enjoy. There's really kind of nothing better than when you're with some friends and you're playing and it's really going well, and everybody's like, "Oh my God, this is just great!" And it's kind of a really cool thing, and all musicians kind of can appreciate that when it happens.
For sure. Now, how did you get involved with computers and synthesizers?
I think the real start, computers goes way back. I was always really interested in technology, in computers. I mean, I obviously growing up watching Star Trek and Lost in Space and sci-fi of all sorts. It was always computers, and so we didn't have computers back then, but you could see them on TV. And so I was really interested in them and excited about being able to program them and play with them. But I didn't really get a computer, have access to one until I was ninth grade, I guess high school. School I went to out in Ohio had a digital equipment PDP-8, which was a pretty standard computer, a mini computer back then. I would always, be there in the computer room all my spare time, screwing around, playing. They had computer games back then. They weren't like today's games, but they were little things you could play against a computer. Things like tic-tac-toe or a game called Hammurabi, where you could sort of buy and sell cattle and grain, and it was kind of a very early origin of sort of thing like SimCity, where you have to build a little civilization and control it. And I see there were some very rudimentary games at the time, but programming the computer was fun too. Trying to come up with your own little games and writing programs was a lot of fun.
When did you start writing programs, Bill?
It seems kind of crazy, but the first programs I wrote were just on a little computer language that I kind of made up. I had a good friend back in elementary school whose dad had access to a Wang computer of some sort. It was a very early, kind of like a pretty rudimentary computer, more like a calculator, like a programmable calculator. It had like 2 registers, A and B, and it could do mathematical operations. But it had some way of stepping through a program and reading and writing to memory. And so he explained this to me, and I kind of wrote down the instructions. And I just used those instructions to try to write my own programs to do things like play tic-tac-toe. And so I remember sitting around literally writing programs in this language for which there really wasn't a computer. It was kind of purely notional. But that was exciting for me, just being able to sort of think how it might run. It might execute these instructions and do something, like play a game. I happened to go to a private school for a while, from 4th to 7th grade, and they had a computer system. It took up a whole room. It was a Honeywell computer. And it wasn't for the kids. It was really for doing accounting and financial stuff. And it wasn't used just by our school. It was a whole bunch of schools used that computer center to do accounting of reports of some sort. But once we were allowed to go in and program it, I still remember the program. It was programmed in COBOL. And I wrote a simple program to accept 2 numbers printed out on little cards, because that's how you got all the information in and out of a computer, was on these printed cards. And it read 2 cards, added the 2 numbers, and printed the result on this line printer that was the size of a minivan, And it worked. It read 2 and 3 and added them and printed 5 on a huge piece of paper. There was a little 5 at the top. It's like, it worked. So that was the first computer program I wrote and had run on a computer.
But going back to your own computer language that you made up for the Wang system, where did that come from? I'm just trying to figure out the kind of mind you had. Like you were thinking that this could be the way it would work, or should be the way it would work, or did you read it somewhere and revise what you read? Did you build it from scratch? Where did it come from, the concept of, designing your own language and making your own sort of instruction set?
Yeah, I think it was just from this conversation that I had with my friend back in elementary school. He was obviously really mathematical and into computers and stuff. And he had actually gotten to play with this early Wang computer, and he described it to me, how it kind of worked. And he might have shown me some of the instruction sets. I just sort of took it from there. I mean, it was a very simple kind of thing you can imagine doing with a calculator. Put a number in A equals 5, B equals 6, B equals A plus B, kind of a thing, If A less than B, then go to this instruction. So pretty simple.
How old are you now at this time, Bill? You're 9th grade, right?
Then I was pretty young in elementary school, so somewhere between 4th and 7th grade. Once I got into 9th grade and had a real computer, back then the programming language that everybody used, particularly on these digital mini computers, was BASIC. It was just a very simple language that was interpreted. I mean, you could just type the instructions in, it would run it right then and there. And, you know, it had just very simple mathematical operations, comparison and jump. It could loop and jump. Um, and basically it could read input from the keyboard and print to the typewriter, and that was basically it. But you could use that to build a little, you know, you could write a little game of tic-tac-toe or something like that.
Yeah, I used to program in BASIC. I used to program in BASIC back in the day. I remember I programmed the clock.
Yeah, cool.
And I didn't have a way to save it, so I had to write down all the instruction. And then the problem with the clock, it would drift, so you had to go back in and make the adjustment, wait for it to drift, and it took longer and longer to drift away from real time. So that was the days of BASIC. I remember it well. So you are now you're now thoroughly into computers in high school.
Yeah, I was into computers in high school. I knew I was interested in technology. I really wanted to go to MIT. I was kind of really set my sights on that. And I did, in fact, I think just by the skin of my teeth, barely got into MIT. And even though I had this idea that I was going to study math or physics or something, once I got to MIT, I realized that I really just wanted to do computers. And so I ended up just taking the program in computer science. It was electrical engineering and computer sance. I learned a lot of different programming languages there. I ended up discovered this place. It was in the Department of Architecture. It's called the Architecture Machine Group, which was kind of the predecessor of what is now known as the MIT Media Lab. And it was this amazing place full of all sorts of, at the time, very high-tech gadgets. So they had computers, obviously, but they had what you couldn't find anywhere else. They had color graphics. So they had what was called a frame buffer, a Ramtech frame buffer. It could actually draw color graphics on a video screen. And it was amazing. So you could write programs that would just draw shapes and objects on a screen. So it's sort of opening up the whole world of computer graphics. They also had video disc players, and they had projection TVs and surround sound systems and speech recognition, some of the early speech recognizers. And they were taking all this stuff and kind of building cool demos for, a lot of the work was done for the DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. It was sort of defense money, but it was just money flowing in to fund kind of cool research and sort of advanced applications of computers. And I ended up doing my bachelor's thesis. It was sort of more of a computer graphics thing. I did a visualization of molecular vibration. So I was drawing molecules on the screen, and the only way we had at the time to animate them was literally to take film pictures of the whole sequence. So I would go in there at night, and I had a Bolex 16 millimeter camera that I would set up on a stand in front of the monitor, and it would draw a frame of the molecule, and I would take a picture, and they would draw the next frame and take a picture, and it would take all night, and you end up with like 20 seconds of footage or something. But that was my bachelor's thesis. It was pretty cool. I mean, it wasn't too much after that the technology just became, the stuff was all real time, and you would just save it to a file. You didn't, it got a lot easier later.
So you leave MIT. Did you do any postgraduate studies there?
No, I ended up getting a job out in California, in San Francisco, with this guy who had given me consulting work when I was an undergrad. He was a banker, and he was starting up a home banking system. He was unfortunately way ahead of his time. He had this idea of people would be doing their banking at home, as they would be. But this was really before they even had like ATM machines. And the only kind of dial-up modems were like 300 baud things. And remember, you had to like plug the handset into this thing with the rubber cups. And it was like really old technology. And personal computers were very rudimentary back then as well. But so I worked for him for a couple of years, and I lived in this very cool communal living group in downtown San Francisco. And there was a lot of artists and musicians and stuff living there because it was cheap. And I met this guy, Mike Trout, who was a musician, and he had gotten a degree in music, and his thesis work was really intriguing to me. He had created this piece of music that was all bells. He'd recorded all these individual bells And they created an entire piece of music by splicing magnetic tape together. Because this is like before the days where you had a digital editor where you could do this. So he would just make copies of these bell sounds on magnetic tape, and then literally just go in there and cut the tape up and assemble the whole piece of music by splicing tape. And that was really cool to he had some other pieces as well that he had done through the same technique of just tape splicing. And he was real interested in synthesis, and he was looking at these modular synthesizers back then and really wanted to buy one. And so we would hang out a lot together, and he'd look at these catalogs for these modular synthesizers. And there was a company in San Francisco called Surge Modular. And people who know analog synths probably remember them. This is back in the age of Moog and Buchla. They were sort of a lesser known manufacturer. But so we ended up going and visiting. That was not that far from where we lived. We ended up visiting the company there and saw all the stuff they were building. And that was just really cool to get demos of these analog synths and making cool sounds. And Mike ended up buying a couple of modules. So all this stuff it's incredible how it's very similar in a way to the whole Euro rack movement right now. It's kind of the same sort of stuff. So he bought some modules, and that whole thing, meeting Mike and hearing his pieces of music and seeing the modular synthesizers, and I was playing a lot of guitar then, and it really got me interested in synthesis. Something like I really want to get into this. And when I ended up moving back to Boston area from San Francisco, I was looking around for work. I saw an ad in the Boston Globe for if you love music and love computers, we have a job for you. And I followed up on it immediately. And that ended up being Kurzweil Music Systems. Though it wasn't called Kurzweil Music Systems at the time. It was still in stealth mode. But it was Kurzweil. And the guy who I was working for was this a guy named Bob Chidlaw, who's a super genius guy. He was an MIT grad, physics major, and he had been hired by Ray, kind of as the head engineer of the original Kurzweil 250.
So what was it like to be working at Kurzweil? And, you know, everybody knows about Ray Kurzweil, this genius man that made a machine that could read text and speak it. So what was it like there for you, a young man coming into this world?
Well, it was tremendously exciting. Like I was just, so excited to be there. It seemed like a total dream job. So, yeah, sort of the origin of the whole thing was that by virtue of the fact that Ray had built this reading machine, Stevie Wonder was one of his customers, and they developed a relationship. And I guess Ray and Stevie started talking about how you could make a digital piano. And Ray had the kind of the vision or forethought to think that you could simply record the piano sounds into a computer of sorts and then play them back. And I think Ray had done some experiments with recording pianos and playing them back, changing the pitch. And I guess he convinced himself that you wouldn't have to necessarily record every single note at every amplitude. You could record, maybe sample fewer than the full thing, and maybe you could loop the piano sound rather than having to record the entire duration of the note. So that, in other words, he had the idea that you could do it with the current technology. You could maybe make a really good simulation of a grand piano using the technology of the time, which is the early 1980s. So when I arrived at Kurzweil, there was just a small group of engineers there sort of busily working on the very first version of the K250. And the basic architecture of the K250 was that it had all the sounds burned into ROM. It had a sort of a low-powered CPU and this thing called the channel group processor. That was the thing that could, the playback engine that would fetch samples from the ROMs and then send them over to this other huge circuit board called the channel board. And it had 12 discrete channels. So each one could take a stream of samples from the playback from the raw memory and then turn it into an analog signal. Then it was all mixed in analog and came out the back. But even with just those 12 note polyphony, you could make a really convincing sound of a grand piano and other instruments as well.
So did you ever get to see any VIPs or any celebrities come by there to test out the instruments?
Oh yeah, I remember very early on when I was there, like Sonny and Cher came by. It's like, wow, that's cool. I think Stevie came by every now and then periodically to check up on things. There were other musicians coming by. I remember Arlo Guthrie came by. He had this huge, I think a school bus. It was all painted up kind of like the Partridge Family. He had that parked outside and he had kind of an entourage with him. Came in and visited. And there were always musicians coming by. What I remember well was Lyle Mays, who was a local. He was sort of, people maybe remember him as Pat Metheny's keyboard player. He was like just a really talented piano player. Super nice guy. And he would come by and he did a lot of demos for us. He was also an early user. And he'd come by and it was just amazing to hear him play the 250. Like he'd pull up a patch like pianos with slow strings, where you'd hit the piano, you hear the piano, and then if you hold it down, these sort of strings come in from underneath. It was like a beautiful patch, and he could really just make soaring music on the thing. It was like, so that was really cool to have these well-known musicians coming by and playing the stuff that we were building.
So what was your role in this whole engineering ensemble?
Yeah, so early on, I was kind of the new kid. So I got to do all the sort of utility programs. The very first thing that they needed doing was they needed to burn ROM chips. So I had to write the software that would take the data from this Hewlett-Packard emulation system that we're writing all the code on and send it down to the ROM burner. And that spun into, I had to write the program that assembled all the sounds together and figured out how to pack them into the ROMs, and then built the presets, like the keyboard patches and the key maps and whatnot, and then assemble all that material and then burn that into the chips. And that sort of led to having to write the sound modeling program for the 250, which was a hugely challenging task.
Explain that, because you have a sample that is the source sitting in ROM. How do you model that sound? What is involved in modeling it?
So the term sound modeling was kind of a marketing buzzword applied to how the technology worked. It was truly just what we now know as a sampler. So the whole technology is you make recordings of acoustic instruments or any kind of instrument. You do a lot of processing in them to clean up the recording. You do a lot of amplitude compression, and when the sound, if the sound has a very static decay, then you can do a loop and simulate the decay using an amplitude envelope, like a VCA, voltage controlled amplifier. So the basic idea for a piano is you would record maybe every major third or fourth or something, a note, and then when the person's playing, you're taking the sample that you have and you're pitch shifting it a little bit to get the pitch you want. And as it's playing out, you're applying an amplitude envelope so it decays correctly, and then when it hits the static section of sound, even though it's really not that static, you can do a little loop, repeating the same samples over and over again. So that whole process was kind of branded sound modeling and meant to sound very kind of mysterious, and that was kind of a marketing thing that Kurzweil did. But it was really just what we now know as sort of a sample playback engine. With that said, the 250 wasn't really designed to sample your own sounds in. It was really the sort of focus was to do a really good job of curating a bunch of sounds ahead of time and processing them and making it a really good grand piano, have really good bowed strings and choir and orchestral instruments. And so the emphasis was kind of on playing back these instruments that we had already installed at the factory. But somebody had the foresight to put in a little circuit with a A to D converter that could actually, so that the users could sample their own sounds. The problem is the software for this thing, there was so much work to do at Kurzweil, and it was all done in such a tremendous hurry to get this product out the door, that really doing the user sampled stuff was sort of an afterthought. And there were already units out there in the field that had this little circuit in, but the circuit really hadn't even been tested. And so that the product, the idea of doing user sampling kind of was very much an afterthought. But they tasked me with getting it all to work. So I wrote a program to, wrote the software to actually sample the audio into the 250 and do all the processing inside the 250 on the little processor that was in there, that we would normally do on our other computers and would be done under human supervision. But this was trying to make it all automatic, doing it all in just the 250 CPU. It ended up being very challenging.
Wow, I gotta say, this is kind of like a crazy moment for me because I spent many years making hundreds and hundreds of sample patches for the Kurzweil. We used to store them off on a Macintosh. Yeah, made hundreds of them. Had to do the looping. Yeah, we used to use the software to dump them over
The
to
QLS
the
convert.
to store them over there, and you load them in.
The link.
Yeah, QLS, yeah.
QLS, yeah. I wrote that too.
Yeah. Wow. So I was using your software at that time. I didn't even know who you were. So you, how long were you at Kurzweil?
Yeah, so up until about 1990, so it was there from like 83 to 90. So those were the sort of glory days, and for whatever reason, they couldn't make a go of it, and the company did sort of go bankrupt actually, and was then bought by Young Chang. They were makers of pianos, and Young Chang kind of injected some money into it and kept it going. I mean, it's still going to this day. They build nice, electronic pianos that not completely up on the product line, but I know they're still a going concern now.
So what did you do next after the company goes bankrupt?
Well, I knew that I really wanted to learn more about signal processing, like audio signal processing, because I'd had a taste of it at Kurzweil, and I didn't have enough mathematical background, basically, to do the sorts of things I wanted to do. So I decided to go back to grad school, and it turns out I had some connection to the Media Lab, which had since been founded. And I got in and met this guy, Barry Vercoe. And Barry had been the founder of the Experimental Music Studio at MIT. He was a composer and had written this program called C-Sound, which was like a music synthesis language. It was used in a lot of computer music, academic kind of settings. And I guess I impressed upon him that I had what it took to be a good student and maybe do some interesting things. And so he accepted me as one of his students at the Media Lab. And that was great. I got to go to, spend time at the MIT Media Lab and took a lot of courses in acoustics and signal processing and mathematics. And I got to play on doing things with audio and signal processing.
And what did you do when you left your graduate studies at MIT?
Well, I didn't have much of a plan. It's funny that I think I had sort of lucked into these other opportunities earlier in my life just by complete serendipity. Like, going to Kurzweil, for instance, was kind of just a very low probability event. And I think also getting into the Media Lab. And so maybe I was just thinking, well, I didn't really have to plan. Something will just come along, right? So that's actually a really bad idea for people. You should think about what you want to do and plan ahead. But I knew I didn't really want to become an academic. But I think that path was open. I probably could have tried to teach and become a professor somewhere. I could have tried to join a big company. I thought I really sort of wanted to do my own thing, see if I could write software, do consulting, and spin it into some kind of a business. But frankly, I didn't have really much of a plan at all. But I had established a relationship with Denon and Analog Devices, as I mentioned earlier. So I had a kind of a sort of a foothold there by which I could, get a little bit of revenue coming in by doing some licensing and some technology development, sort of based on the work that I had done at the Media Lab.
So when did you first get the idea to make plugins?
Yeah, I don't have an exact memory of it, but it's funny, when I was at the Media Lab, I had developed this thing called a room simulator, and this was on cards made by DigiDesign. DigiDesign, of course, was the precursor to Avid and Pro Tools. And actually, I first met the DigiDesign people at the very first NAMM show I went to back in 1984. It was Evan Brooks and Peter Gotcha were there with a little Macintosh, and they had a little plug-in sound card that could do recording. And that turned into, they had their sound designer software. And that, of course, just evolved into Pro Tools and DigiDesign. It was a huge success. And when I was at the Media Lab, I had been using their audio media DSP cards as little DSP engines, because at the time, you really couldn't do anything on the processors. They were just too slow to do any real-time signal processing. So you had to buy DSP cards, and DigiDesign made this thing called the audio media card. So I had a rig where I had two Macintoshes, one with 4 cards and one with 2 cards, and each one would program a single channel of reverb. And I could run a sound into all 6 channels, and each one fed a different loudspeaker. So you'd sit at the center of this ring of loudspeakers, and you could move a sound around, pan it around, and click different room presets and change the reverberation. And it was kind of a cool little demo of sort of a surround sound reverb.
But it required multiple audio media
Yeah,
cards.
I had to have one per channel, basically. But at the time, I was visited by somebody from DigiDesign, whose name I forget right now. But this was right when they were coming out with hardware, their TDM hardware, and they had this sort of DSP farm card. It was like a card that had a whole bunch of DSP chips on it, not just one like the audio media, but a whole set of them. And that was like a real opportunity then to just maybe stop doing my thesis work and just leave grad school and just start a software company right then and there. And I didn't take it. I decided I wanted to continue and get my degree, and then think about things later. But that was the idea of doing plugins. That was kind of the idea is that they had this idea of, we're going to build this DSP card. We're going to let third-party developers write software for this thing. And that's kind of where a lot of the companies like Waves kind of got started doing plugins for this TDM platform and Pro Tools. That's kind of where it started. And I think Steinberg then had their VST things, came out later. Certainly by the time I graduated, there was some ecosystem of plugin companies and formats. I can't remember the exact set right now, but it was clear that, this is something that I could build. I could take some of the algorithms that I'm developing and spin it into some products that I could sell myself.
And what was the first product, Bill?
I think the very first thing I had was this thing called Wave Surround, which was this virtualization technology, basically to take stereo and either present it as two binaural sources over headphones or over loudspeakers to be able to make a super wide, to get the super wide spatial effect. And there was just like a little plug-in that we sold for a while. I guess the first format was a Winamp plug-in. Wow, it's really bringing back memories. You remember Winamp, the first little MP3 player? Yeah, they had plugins. Yeah, so it was a Winamp plugin. But then later, must have had a DirectX version or something like that. That really wasn't the first sort of real serious plugins. Were sort of the Masterverb and Track Plug. Those were Masterverb was like a nice sounding reverb, stereo reverb, and Track Plug was a channel strip with EQ and compression. And I had been doing some consulting for a company called Media 100, which was like a video editing company that was in the Boston area, and they needed a lot of help with their audio processing. And so I wrote all the sort of EQs and compressors and limiters and some surround sound positioning and a lot of the sort of audio algorithms that they needed to go alongside with their video stuff. And I did it in a way that I could retain the IP, so I'd license the technology to them, but retain the ownership of the IP, and then I could spin it into products. So that kind of business model worked for me as a way to sort of bootstrap my company by doing some consulting or licensing, getting some money in to stay fed, and also sort of thinking more for the long term to build up a line of my own products that I could sell to end users.
You seem to have been very interested in this sort of spatialization and sound in three dimensions. Was that something that came out of your first sort of experience at MIT, where you studied a lot of 3D stuff, or was that in the graduate program?
When I was an undergrad, I did 3D, but it was graphics. I hooked up with this guy called Scott Fisher, who was at the Visible Language Workshop, another little group at MIT, and he had been doing a lot of 3D imaging. And you know those little when you get like a novelty card and it's kind of 3D, or a cup and you can see, or you turn it and it all moves. That technology is called lenticular, and basically it's a bunch of little bumps, like a plastic sheet on top with a bunch of little bumps on it that are lenses essentially. And so you actually make a photograph underneath it with little strips of image. And so it sends different images out. It depends on how you look at it, the angle you're looking at it, you'll see a different image. And so you can use it to make sort of dynamic moving things or 3D. And so he had a system that he could make these 3D pictures, and he let me use it. And I was going around campus taking 3D photographs of things. So, and then printing them in a dark room, and that was really cool. Just the idea of, it wasn't audio 3D; it was like a 3D vision. I think somehow that got me also interested later in 3D sound. I'm not sure how, but when I got in grad school, I had been studying reverberation algorithms and whatnot at Kurzweil, and I wanted to keep doing that. And Barry, my advisor at MIT, had also suggested he was interested in 3D sound, and so I started studying 3D localization and perception at the Media Lab.
Now, explain to us in the simplest way the reverberation algorithm. It's in the most basic form, a whole bunch of delays.
Yeah, so the simplest reverb algorithm is just a delay line with some recirculation. So you know, if you imagine just a delay line, you put the signal in, it goes, and then you loop some of it back. And that's just sort of gives you this echo kind of effect. To turn that into something that sounds more like natural reverberation, you can either use a lot of them and sort of put them all in parallel, or you can try to break the echoes up more inside a single delay line. So you can use this other little thing called an all-pass filter. And an all-pass filter is also you can make with a delay line, but with a feed forward and a feedback. And it's done in a way that it's all pass. It has the same frequency response it lets all frequencies through equally. It just messes around with their phases, basically. So you can think of it as kind of a diffuser. Like you put a little all-pass filter in a delay line. When the signal goes through it, it'll kind of be sort of smoothed out or diffused, but all the components are still there. So kind of like blurring a photograph or diffusing a sound by having it reflect off of a kind of a rough-shaped wall or something. So one way to build a reverb is then to have a recirculating delay line and put a lot of these diffusing elements in it. So it kind of propagates over time, but it gets sort of diffuse and sort of nice sounding.
And then another way is just to create a lot of delays, but then that way would create a lot more CPU load, right?
Yeah, it's memory too. The technique of using a fairly short delay line and putting a lot of diffusing elements in it lets you build a reverb with a very small amount of memory. That was a big deal back then. It's probably nobody cares about memory anymore. But at the time, like even these little audio media cards I was using, I think they might have only had 64K bytes total of RAM. So you had to put everything in there, the program and all your delay lines and everything. So you had to kind of pack things in. Even today, if you're using a guitar pedal, I'm pretty disappointed with most of the reverbs you get on a guitar pedals. And I guess they've started to get better, but a lot of them sound very cheesy, and that's because there's just not enough delay in there to do anything interesting or good sounding.
Now, when you come to convolution, because I know you've done convolution reverb as well, how is that different from the more algorithmic reverb? And again, explain it in the most simplest way.
Yeah, so an algorithmic reverb is like I just described, where you're putting sound into essentially a delay line with a bunch of recirculating taps in there and mixing it all around, and out it comes and it sounds like a reverb. Convolution is more of a sort of a mathematical operation where you're basically sampling the initial reverb and then you're reproducing it as a mathematical operation, exactly reproducing that exact impulse response you measure. So you can think of it as you have a room with a microphone and a speaker, and you put a click you can imagine that the digital audio sound is actually a bunch of zeros followed by a 1, followed by zeros, and that's just a pure click, pure impulse. You excite the system with that impulse and record the result, and that's called the impulse response of the system. Now, if you want to apply that to a different signal, what you would do is you would simply shift and scale that impulse response for every single sample in your input signal. And it's doing it the naive way is very computationally expensive, just insanely expensive. But there are techniques, mathematical techniques, you can do it more efficiently using things called fast Fourier transforms, block convolution techniques. But the idea, again, is that you have a system where you've measured the impulse response and you're applying that exact impulse response to your input signal.
That just seems like it's computationally extremely dense. And how, when you mathematically recreate it, I mean, this is a matter of taste, put a number on it. How close do you get to the original?
Well, it's essentially exact, except for some subtle issues. One is that acoustical spaces are always changing a little bit. So you've got like air currents and there's heat sources and ventilation and things. So if you measure the impulse response and just wait a minute and measure it again, it's not going to be exactly the same. It's like constantly changing a little bit. And in fact, in the algorithmic reverbs, they often suffer from a problem of they can be very resonant at particular frequencies, so they sort of ring kind of, and they sound sort of metallic. And that's a real challenge in algorithmic design, is making a reverb algorithm that doesn't have these sort of nasty metallic resonances in it. And the simplest way to get rid of them is actually to put some kind of a time variation in there, some modulation. So typically you put like a little pitch modulator in there, and it tends to sort of smooth everything out. But if you put too much in, it starts to sound like kind of a swoosh, and it doesn't sound, that's too much. It sounds like a toilet flushing kind of, and not like a reverb.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, let me ask the question another way. How accurate is the measurement of the room?
I think the measurements of the room can be done very accurately. Um, it's kind of the limit of technology now. Our audio reproduction and recording systems are pretty accurate. They have low distortion, high dynamic range, low noise, so you can send an excitation signal to a speaker, record it on a microphone, do some mathematics to recover the impulse response, and get an extremely accurate measurement of that room.
The sample rate and bits have to do have an impact on this measurement? I mean, to what degree, I should say? Does the sample rates and the bit depth have to do with the accuracy of the measurement?
You can actually get away with fairly low bit rate, because if you use an excitation signal like a noise sequence or a swept sine, like something that starts at a very low tone and sweeps up to a very high tone, when you get that recording, even though maybe it's all 8 bits, when you do the so-called the deconvolution operation and recover the impulse response from it, you gain a lot of bits in there because you're averaging over a long signal. If you were to do the impulse response measurement by literally sending a click out, that ends up being a very bad way to do the measurement, because it has very low signal energy. It's just a little tiny tick sound. And so you're recording mostly background noise. For that to work, you'd have to repeat that over and over and over again and average them all together to get an impulse response that had good signal to noise ratio. Otherwise, you're going to just be recording a lot of background noise. So the better way of doing these measurements now is to use a different kind of measurement signal, that like a noise sequence or a swept sine.
Now, for the recovery of the impulse response, is there a body of are there resources out there ready-made that you could take and modify, or is it something you have to do in a proprietary way?
Well, there's a whole bunch of software out there to, do recordings of rooms and recover impulse responses. Myself, I've released a free program called MLS Tool. Not a very good name, but it is a program which will play in what's called a maximum length sequence, which is a noise sequence. And you can record it, and it'll do the deconvolution and spit out the impulse response. But there are other commercial software out there to do this kind of thing. So there's a lot out there.
And is there, I mean, and this would be a loaded question, of course. That's why I asked how accurate is the measurement. Are all these the same? Will all of them give you the same result?
Well, for acoustical spaces, sort of a bigger issue is how you mic it and how you excite the room. What kind of speaker are you using? Where are you locating it? If you're trying to recreate, if you're thinking like classical music and trying to recreate, say, a violin on a stage, the violin itself has a very complicated, what's called a transmission pattern, or I should actually know the proper name, but its response pattern. So it's not sending the same frequencies out in all directions equally. And so if you then take a loudspeaker, just a regular stereo loudspeaker, put it up on stage, say maybe with a tweeter and a woofer pointing out, and you record it with a microphone, and then you record the impulse response, put it into your convolutional reverb, then you play your violin through it, it's not going to be exactly the same as that same violin being on stage. So you have all these other very complicated issues about how you capture the emission, the acoustical emission from, say, an acoustical source like a violin, and then, recreating the sound of the concert hall through convolution. But it's a very good first approximation of the acoustics of the scene. So it's pretty darn good, not perfectly accurate.
Okay, so now let's look at the 3D spatialization, which is also one of your keen interests, and you've got a great product called Panorama. In the simplest way, how do you take a signal and simulate 3D space when we just have two speakers or headphones with two cans on our head? How is it you're doing that without giving away any trade secrets?
I'm happy to give away all the trade secrets as usual. This technique is called binaural synthesis, is obviously well known. It's been around for a while, but it all relies on how we hear spatial audio, how we perceive it, because we only have two ears. And so when there's sounds out in space, how can we tell where they are? It's pretty easy to see how we could determine left from right based on maybe the loudness of the sound. If something's over here, it's going to be louder in this ear than in the opposite side ear. And similarly, it's going to arrive at one ear before it arrives at the other. And it turns out our auditory system uses both of these cues, both the level difference between the ears and also the time difference of arrival, to get a pretty good idea of where things are in a left to right axis. But the other directions, like how can you tell something's in front or behind or up or down, that's all done by these pinnae, these external ears we have, which have this sort of odd shape. And those basically impart a sort of a directionally dependent equalization to the incoming sound. So it's like somebody's there, the sound's coming from up here, it's going to go through this EQ shape. If it's down here, it's going to go through a different EQ shape. So just based on kind of the timbre of the sound arriving at the ears, our auditory system is able to decide if something's up or down or in front or in back based on sort of the spectral content of the signals. It's kind of an amazing trick.
And so these are known spectral signatures.
Yes, a lot of people have studied both localization of sound by humans, where they just do lots of localization tests and try to determine how well we can localize. You put a blindfold over someone, put them in an anechoic chamber, send sounds out from different locations, and they have to indicate where they hear it from. You get a pretty good idea of people's abilities across, a sample population. And it turns out we're extremely good at localizing left to right. I mean, down to we have literally microsecond resolution in our ability to discern delays coming to our two ears. But we have much poorer ability when it comes to determining elevation and front back. Those are kind of naturally ambiguous cues. It depends a lot upon the nature of the sound that you're hearing, if you're familiar with it. It also depends a lot on head motion. We can do a lot of, if we simply move our head while we're hearing a sound, that'll tend to let us know whether something's in front or behind quite readily. And so the head motion tends to resolve a lot of ambiguity as to where the sound could be coming from.
So how did you put this into Panorama? Because this product is very unique.
Yeah, so the first step was actually based on research I did at the Media Lab. I along with my, at the time, roommate, Keith Martin, we produced a set of head-related, what are called head-related transfer functions. They should probably more be called head-related impulse responses. They're very similar to the impulse response I was describing when talking about room reverberation. The idea is that you want to capture how sound gets from an external source point to both ears. And so you go into an anechoic chamber. We had a dummy head microphone with little microphones inside its ears. and we excited this sound, played noise through a little tiny speaker, and recorded both ears. And we had the dummy head on a turntable that could rotate to any angle under computer control. So we would make a measurement, then rotate it 5 degrees, make another measurement, rotate it 5. And so we did this at elevations from up on top of the head all the way down to about minus 40 degrees. And we released the data publicly. It's called the MIT KEMAR data. KEMAR was the microphone, the dummy head microphone we used. And that was a neat project to work on. Got a lot of good feedback from having released the public domain set of responses to the research community. But so to carry on from that, to synthesize a sound and have it sound like it's coming from a particular place and around your head, you basically use those head-related impulse responses as filters, digital filters, and sort of apply them to the source signal. And therefore, you'll be reproducing the same cues that you would normally get if that sound was going in and being filtered by the external ear and arriving at one ear before the other. And so you get the spectral cues, the level difference cues, and the time delay cues are all sort of encoded in these head-related impulse responses. So my Panorama plugin basically has a database of these responses, and when you run a signal into it, it's using these responses as digital filters, and you can sort of dynamically move the sound around, and it's crossfading and interpolating between the filters in real time, so you do it without clicks. And the Panorama also has the ability to add room reflections and reverb. It's a lot like the stuff that I was doing with my room simulator algorithm back at MIT. Some early echoes and some late reverberation to put it into a space so you sound like you're in a room. That also tends to give it a distance cue, because one of the ways that we can determine whether or not a sound is close or far away is if it sounds more reverberant, it's typically far away. If the sound gets sort of weaker, but you get this ambient reverb, it sounds, we're in a big room and it's at the other end of the room. But then as it comes closer, the sound gets loud, but the reverb stays about the same. It gives a good distance impression.
Oh, it's very true. It's very natural. Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. You also did some work for Raytheon. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
When I was at MIT as an undergrad, I think Raytheon had a program by which they were hiring college students for summer jobs doing programming. I can't remember exactly how I found out about it, but I did work there for a couple summers in the advanced equipment division of Raytheon. It was not too far from my house. Nice commute. It's kind of a little strange being kind of at a quasi-military. I mean, like you had to go through past the guard tower, and everything was like high security, a lot of locks and fences, and they had security monitors coming around the building, checking that you weren't leaving confidential materials out on the desk. So that part was a little odd, although I guess understandable given that they were building military equipment. But besides that, it was kind of cool to just go and have a job programming. I was struck at how much lower tech the equipment was at Raytheon than what I'd gotten used to at MIT. I mean, at MIT, I was programming on this is still before the internet and before personal computers, but nevertheless, I was using a video terminal. So when I was editing code, I was able to move my cursor up and down and type, and things would just appear so I could edit code in a sort of fairly natural way and then run it. But at Raytheon, they were still using punch cards, right? So they were just typing everything out onto those little punch paper cards, and you'd walk around with these big decks of cards, and you'd read those in. And if you wanted to do an edit, you had to swap out some of your lines of code for some other cards, and it did seem like they were sort of 10 years behind where I had been at MIT. That's kind of the bit I remember. I was actually trying to impress upon them, boy, you should really write a new editor for your system, work on your tools. In other words, try to improve the way that you do the software rather than worrying about the software you're writing. You really need to step up your game. But I was a kid. I was the junior of the most junior level there, and they assigned me the most rudimentary tasks. Like I had to put the logo on the report that was generated after doing a diagnostic run of the missile system. So that's what I did. I managed to make sure that the logo appeared somewhere on the report. I wasn't able to do any of the cool stuff, the missile guidance or anything like that.
I see. GPS guidance systems.
Yeah, they were working on
all that kind of stuff real time.
They were doing cool stuff. They had to deal with a boat that was in heavy seas, going up and down, trying to keep the thing pointed at the target, and they had phased array radars there. Those were sort of newfangled radar systems that didn't have a single dish, but used a lot of little elements, so you could send signals out, and based upon the delays to all the elements, you could get the wavefront to go one way or the other. So there was some cool technology there, but the software was kind of a little bit more old school.
You also made some great restoration tools. What are some of the technologies? Are these your algorithms as well for restoration, removing of hiss, noise, things like this?
Yeah, those are algorithms I developed. There's a long history in the academic world of doing this sort of stuff. So there are technical papers on how to do noise removal. And so I studied the literature and picked out some of the papers that I liked that I thought, try to code up some of the algorithms using MATLAB, which is a tool that engineers often use to do simulations of things. And the noise removal stuff, I'm pretty happy with the way it came out. It was based on this one paper by Andy Moore, who had been at Lucasfilms in the old days doing their Sound Droid system, and he had written some papers on reverb, so I was following his work, and he had written a nice paper on noise removal, and that stuff seemed pretty pertinent. I based a lot of my stuff, I think, on his techniques and some short time Fourier analysis papers that have been written.
And in a nutshell, Bill, again, without giving away too much, how do you remove a noise component from a signal without degrading the signal too much?
You end up degrading it a little bit. Basically, the idea is you're thinking of the signal in the frequency domain and trying to, I guess ahead of time, you measure the noise profile, so you measure the sort of background hiss level, and that gives you what's called a noise profile, where the sort of noise level is. And then as the music's playing, in any sort of frequency band, when you get down kind of close to that noise level, you think, well, this signal is probably not signal anymore. It could be noise, so I'm just going to turn it down all the way. It's like running a little noise gate in all the different bands of the spectrum at the same time, where the threshold of the gate is determined by the profile that you've learned already. That's how the classic denoise algorithm works, where you have to train it ahead of time with a bit of the background noise, and then once it's running, it kind of carves out the spectrum when it thinks that you're just playing back the original noise. It carves it out. But of course, in reality, what's happening is that you tend to also carve out some of the high frequencies in your signal as well. So after running these denoisers, it tends to, the signal that's left is sort of less crisp than it was otherwise. But it can still be, still be really effective and sound really good.
And then you got into distortion. You got into distortion. You built a distortion plugin. That seems like a little bit of a different direction for you.
Definitely a little bit. I'm a guitarist, so I play through guitar amps, and long ago realized I just didn't like the sound of solid state amps. They just sound dry and they just don't sound that good. But a tube amp, you plug into a tube amp and play, and it just has this kind of literal warmth. It just sounds better. So trying to figure that out to some extent. Again, this is another area of academic interest, that there is a whole set of literature on tube amp simulation, but I found that this was a real challenge because I didn't see a lot out there that was really all that great. So I had, I mentioned earlier that I've worked for Bob Chidlaw at Kurzweil. I actually bought one of his homemade amps. He's a real tinkerer. He builds everything. He was building his own tube guitar amps, and I bought one of them. So I had this sort of a homemade amp, which was convenient because it was fairly easy to disassemble parts of it. So I was able to disassemble bits and then run tests, kind of isolate little tube circuits inside of that amp and do some tests of the different circuits and see how things were working and try to simulate those.
And that's how you built your distortion tool.
Yeah, well, so I started off doing kind of the standard way of building a distortion effect is to use what's called a wave shaper algorithm, where the input samples come in and you map them through a wavetable. It's what I call a wave shaper. And that's a very efficient and easy way to get a kind of a distortion effect. And you can adjust the spectral characteristics of the distortion by adjusting the actual wave shape that you're passing the signal through. So I tried that first, making static measurements of a tube circuit and building a wavetable up from that. And they just didn't have the same depth or character that a real tube circuit had. So looking into it further, I started looking at what's called circuit simulation technology. The best way of describing that is that any kind of an analog circuit with resistors and capacitors and tubes and inductors, and they have a mathematical description. There's a way you could model these things mathematically, which is how analog electronics is engineered. Basically, people write out circuit diagrams and they solve for the transform of the circuit, and you can do a lot by actually analytically modeling the circuit. It gets much more difficult when you introduce elements like tubes because they're nonlinear. They have a sort of more complicated, it makes the math more complicated. You can't just solve for the circuit. You have to do what's called a sort of numerical modeling of it. So I don't know if this is going too advanced here, but
So it's not.
if you
No, but it's not. It's a non-mathematical, non-linear relationship between the input and the output for a
yeah,
tube.
it's still mathematical, but it's nonlinear. So if you think about the I don't know if you remember in mathematics trying to find the zeros of a curve, and for some of them you could just solve, but for some weird shapes, if you didn't know how to find it, you would do a technique. You would just pick a point on the curve and you sort of draw a straight line through the tangent down to the axis, then you go up from there, you try again, and eventually you converge on the proper solution. That's kind of exactly the technique you use to solve for a nonlinear system by sort of iteratively stepping through this process. You arrive at the actual solution.
Now, just from your experience, and this is just out of curiosity. I mean, there's nonlinear and then there's really nonlinear. How nonlinear is a tube?
I guess the people who were designing tube amps in the beginning probably thought that they were pretty linear, and as they wanted they knew enough about amplifiers that they wanted them to be, they're probably designing them to be low distortion, right? They wanted to be able to build PA systems and other recording technology, and in a way that was fairly low distortion that wouldn't completely mess up the sound of the voices and the instruments they were recording and or amplifying. But tubes have a very subtle amount of distortion, and it's a kind of a distortion that imparts just a touch of warmth. It's kind of a surprising thing that a lot of distortion sounds bad. I mean, it sounds like a fuzz box or sounds obviously distorted. But if you put just a little bit of distortion in, it can really bring out a lot in a recording. Even if you take just a standard multi-track recording and add just a little tiny bit of distortion to all the instruments in there, and then listen to it again, it can actually sound somehow clearer and warmer. It's kind of an interesting effect. But with guitars, of course, you're really interested. It's not that subtle. There's enough distortion in a guitar amp, tube amp guitar, so that it sounds immediately better than a transistor amp, because it's giving you some audible overtones that are making the guitar sound richer.
And the tubes don't behave the same way depending on how long they've been turned on.
Oh, well, that's also true. They warm up. Pretty much, once they come up to temperature, they're sort of at their operating conditions, and they're reasonably consistent from that point on. So the trick to building this sort of tube simulation stuff was that I built a numerical simulation of just a two triode, like basically it would be a single tube, but it would have two triode elements in it. And just built a simulation of that, a two triode stage preamp. And that plug was the original tube saturator that I released, which was actually doing the numerical simulation in real time. It's kind of crazy, but it is possible to do this stuff in real time for a small circuit. To do a complete guitar amp would be way too computationally expensive. So what I did for the next version of that plugin was I used the circuit simulation technology I developed to basically pre-calculate lots and lots of tables. And so that's how Tube Saturator 2 works. It's much faster than the original one, but it uses sort of the same underlying technology to simulate the original circuit.
But you pre-calculated in order to just save CPU load and make it faster.
Yep. Yeah, so there's some big tables it loads. It's like maybe 50 megabytes or something like that of tables that it has to load. So it's a bit of data, but it makes the processing go a lot faster because it doesn't have to do this very lengthy numerical simulation, iterative numerical simulation to calculate the internal voltages. It just looks them up in tables.
So Bill, now that you look back, man, you've done some amazing work. I mean, are you happy? You happy with the work? You happy with the plugins? You happy with the tools? You wish you could have done some of them better? You look back and you always know that mistake you made. What do you think when you look back on this series of plugins that you've offered the world?
Yeah, I'm pretty satisfied with them. I mean, there's a couple of exceptions. There's a few that I get a little cringy when a few little things here and there. But in terms of the underlying algorithms that are in there and the design choices I made, for the most part, I really like the product line. The stuff that I've been working on most recently with the convolution reverb is really, really cool. I think it's a really nice unit, and so I'm pretty happy with everything. They look a little dated because I released most of these plugins like maybe 10 years ago, and the UIs haven't changed that much.
How important is the GUI in a plugin in your estimation?
Yeah, I think it's really important. When I first started creating plugins, the UIs, I was thinking, well, what difference does it make, right? It's going to sound the same whether the UI looks good or not. And people are really buying this for the quality of the sound. But fairly quickly realized that you could not sell a product if it didn't really look great. So, and in fact, even more so, you can probably sell kind of crappy stuff if you put a really nice looking UI on it. But I mean, I think it's all important. You've got to have a good sounding algorithm with the proper controls that lets people do what they want to do and, solve the issue that they're having. But then you want it to be in a good sort of workflow. Think about how the plugin is organized and how people control it in practice. They approach it and bring it up and step through all of its capability. And then making it look really nice too, so that that helps with the marketing of it, that it helps with your brand image, and people recognize that, oh, that's that cool product, and just makes it more appealing visually. I think that helps in the sort of overall perception of the product's quality.
What are some of the things most people probably don't know about your company?
Well, right now, I think most people probably think we're bigger than we are, but it's mostly just me at this point. I've had a number of employees over the years. I currently am working with my friend Jeremy Caulfield, who does marketing. But it's mostly just for me on the engineering side. It's just me. So I think that's a little bit kind of more standard for a lot of the smaller plugin developers out there. It can be a fairly small team of people. And you present yourself very professionally through the web, having a nice website, nice product line, good distribution. And so, I think a lot of people, the way that they approach the company, they ask to be put in charge of who's responsible for the phone service or who's responsible for your, who does the videos at your company. And it's like, it's kind of all funneling to me, right, for the most part.
You work alone, but have you collaborated with other companies?
Yeah, so, as I mentioned earlier, I do a lot of external development and consulting. So I'm usually have something going in that front and working with typically much larger companies than my own. I'm working with their engineering department. So I get to collaborate on all sorts of projects that way. Typically not in the plugin arena, but in the plugin area, I haven't collaborated with many other companies. One exception is Impulse Record. This guy Tom Gager down in Nashville, he approached me. He had a big library of impulse responses. He knew I had done work in convolution reverb, and I had always wanted to release a convolution reverb, but really hadn't done so because it's like you can't really release a reverb unless you have tons of impulse responses, and I didn't really want to go out and measure tons of rooms and halls and churches and other gear. But he had a library, so it was kind of a perfect match. So we've created this product together called Convology XT. It's the plugin is a convolutional reverb that I wrote, and it's matched with his libraries, about a dozen or so different libraries of all sorts of vintage gear, both DSP effects, hardware reverbs, plate reverbs, spring reverbs, guitar amps, and probably in the near future we'll be releasing real spaces for rooms and halls and churches and whatnot.
As you know, IMSTA has been hosting these developers. Our goal is really to personalize you guys, differentiate you from just a website or just from a GUI. And of course, we've had this buy the software you use message. What do you think of this push IMSTA has been on for the last 20 years?
I think it's positive. It's nice to just remind people that behind these companies there are people like myself that are toiling away writing software, and it's nice when we get to sell some of it. But I think in the early days, like in the plugin business, there's been a lot of discussion about people using crack software. And it's funny how the different manufacturers respond to this. Some of them adopt a very technological approach. We're going to make it impossible to crack our software. And other people have a very opposite approach. We're just not going to care. We're going to sort of give it away, or sort of not really protect it that much, and make it really cheap. And people want to buy it, they'll buy it. And I've kind of over time, I've sort of drifted to that latter category of not worrying so much about copy protection and trying to defeat the hackers and always be one step ahead. Just accept the fact that there's going to be hacked software, cracked software out there, and not stress about it too much. There's tons of people out there that are willing to pay money for software if it's not too expensive. It does what it should do. It's nice for them. They get to know they've purchased something and they can come back and ask for customer support. That's a huge thing. I get to interact with tons of customers, which is actually one of the most enjoyable parts of my work is interacting with the people that bought my software. And it's, if people who are using cracks don't get to do that.
I mean, our approach has always been the same. We think of the consumers of these music software products in three categories: A, B, and C. The A group will just buy the software that they want. The C group will never buy the software, even if it's $1. And the B group would buy some and crack some. And so the IMSTA approach has always been to celebrate the A group, educate the B group, and to ignore the C group.
Right.
It's been our policy.
Yeah, that's a good way of breaking it down. I think there's definitely people in the B group that, they're not going to, maybe if it's just too tempting, if you need you need the software for just one little thing, you're not going to invest $500 in something that you just need because you need to clean up an image in a particular way, or I don't know. So that people find a crack, download it, get the job done. And they kind of rationalize it as well. I don't really want to invest that much money in this thing because I'm only going to use it a little bit. But they will buy things that they use frequently, particularly if it's reasonably priced. And then there's as you say, the A group. Sometimes they have a good budget. They have a budget, so they can just budget their software and buy what they need, and they don't worry about it. They may be actually more worried about violating the terms of agreements because they're at a big company. They don't want to be caught using cracked software. And then you're absolutely right. There's that C group. There's people, and of course I have tons of users in that group too, who just, there's no way they're going to buy anything. I don't, as you said, I don't lose sleep over, I really don't.
We shouldn't. We shouldn't. So how has that pandemic impacted your business, your consulting business, your plugin business, if you look at them two separately?
Yeah, so it affected my consulting business, rolling it back quite a bit because the company that I was working with a lot at the time had to have massive layoffs and sort of cut back their plans because their business was very negatively affected. So, but the plugin business has actually been growing the past few years. So it's not, I've heard that from my friends who are in the business as well. It's not that unusual to think that people are hanging out at home more and maybe getting back into their recording projects or making some music and getting to spend a little more time in their home studio. So yeah, I think it's been okay.
What do you say to a lot of young people watching this who want to become like you? They want to develop their own software, they want to create their own company. What's the advice from Bill Gardner?
Well, I'm sort of coming from an academic background. I do think it's good to have a kind of an academic foundation in some of the math and the signal processing. It's not strictly needed. I mean, you can kind of do creative things with just a little bit of knowledge, I suppose, and the sort of mathematical algorithms, but certainly as much as you can get will help in terms of understanding the underlying technology. And then in terms of products, I think it's good, and I myself did not do this, but it might have been better to sort of focus on one thing and just do it really well and try to carve out a niche for yourself. Some companies have done that. They've released fairly few products, but just they stay in one little area and they try to just be the player in that one space. And so that's a thing you might think about doing. I myself, I wanted to have kind of a broad product line that had sort of one of everything. And so I created, channel strip, a reverb, a limiter, noise reduction software, tube distortion, try to fill out. And you can see a lot of companies do that as well. They have a sort of a complete product line. There's both approaches. Having taken the the one approach, I wonder if it's maybe would have been better to take the other approach.
But it's worked out for you, Bill. It's worked out for you. You've done some great work.
I've had a good life at this point. No regrets. I enjoy the problems I have to solve on a day-to-day basis. And it's really rewarding to know that people are out there making music and processing audio using my tools. And it's a fun community. I mean, I get to meet a lot of other people who do what I do, and we haven't been getting together so much lately because of COVID. But it's a interesting group of people with similar interests. And
thank you so much, Bill, for taking almost a couple hours out of your time for this. And I look forward to seeing you again when we get together in Anaheim, maybe at NAMM. And I look forward to your future products. And thank you for always being a good supporter of IMSTA and being somebody that I've known and had good friendship with for a long time. So take care of yourself, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks a lot, Ray. It's been great doing this with you. I look forward to the next time we get to see each other in person too.